Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. And today we're going to try to tackle a huge one, identity politics. It's a concept, I think it's fair to say, that's as relevant as it is philosophically complex.
Oh, absolutely.
We could spend a whole deep dive just trying to define it.
Yeah.
But broadly speaking, think about it as political activity and theorizing that really comes out of these shared experiences of injustice among members of, certain social groups.
Right.
We often hear it in the context of challenging, dominant narratives, pushing for self-determination.
Yeah.
For this deep dive, we're primarily drawing from the 2024 Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy entry on identity politics. So we are going deep.
And it's interesting because identity politics, we often hear about it as if like, oh, no, the new thing, or even I have a Western concept. But when you think about it, a lot of social movements, whether we're talking about indigenous rights movements, whether we're talking about nationalist projects, even, regional pushes for self-governance, they all kind of shared this similar logic.
Right.
This idea of like using this collective we, this shared identity as like a basis for fighting for some kind of political change.
So right off the bat, it's global, it's diverse, and it is philosophically complex. I think for our listener, who is no stranger to deep thinking here, one of the first questions that might come to mind is, how do we even define identity in this context? I mean, it feels slippery.
Yeah, no, it's very slippery. It's very slippery. And that's, I think, where things get really, really interesting.
Yeah.
The encyclopedia kind of highlights this like almost tension, right, at the core of identity politics. So on the one hand, it's like this aim to like secure freedom, right, for marginalized groups. But it does so by like leaning on these categories, right, of like race, gender, sexuality, class. But it's like, wait a minute. Those categories themselves, like, aren't those often the source of the oppression in the first place?
It's like using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, right?
Exactly.
And that creates this very interesting philosophical dilemma, it seems.
Yeah.
Because you're relying on the same categories that you're also trying to challenge and maybe even deconstruct.
Totally. And I think, like, one way to kind of, like, think about it is through like this idea of authenticity.
Okay.
Right. So like the philosopher Charles Taylor, he like talked about how like the modern self, right, is all about like, striving to be authentic, to be true to itself. Right. And identity politics, it kind of takes this and is like, OK, well, this is true for individuals, but this is also true. Right. When we think about marginalized groups, they're also seeking to like define themselves on their own terms, not according to the like dominant culture's rules.
Not just to be included, but to be respected as different, right? As having like a unique perspective that deserves to be heard on its own terms.
Exactly. And there's this other philosopher, Sonia Cricks, who really like drives this point home. She argues that like, identity politics is demanding respect for oneself as different.
Right.
Not just inclusion based on like some abstract idea of like shared humanity, right? Like we're all individuals, like, or whatever. It's like, no. I need like respect as like who I am, and who I am is different, right?
And which I think makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
When you think about like historical examples of this, like, think about early feminist movements.
Totally.
It wasn't just about women being treated the same as men.
Yeah.
Right. Within a system that was already kind of designed by and for men. It was like, no, we want to actually change the system itself. And the way we do that is by actually like valuing and bringing to the fore women's experiences and perspectives.
Right. And like a really like powerful illustration of this is like the Combahee River Collective.
Yeah.
This group of Black feminists who like, their 1982 statement, it's like considered this like landmark, this like landmark moment, I should say, in identity politics.
Right.
And they talk about how, their own experiences of both, sexism, but also racism, right? Like even within the feminist movement kind of led them to articulate this like distinct political identity and agenda.
So it's not just, hey, we're women, we want to be treated equally. It's, hey, we are Black women and our experiences are different, right? Like we can't just be lumped into this generic feminist category.
Exactly. Yeah.
And their statement is like so powerful, I think, because it really emphasizes the role of lived experience.
Yes.
Right? Like especially experiences of injustice in actually shaping political consciousness.
Yes.
Now, our listener, I know, being the philosopher that they are, might already be thinking, but hold on a second. Isn't experience subjective? Like, how do we go from like these personal feelings and these personal experiences to like a sound basis for both political action, but also like even philosophical theory.
Right. That's like the key question. And that's what gets to the like heart of this debate, you
Yeah.
know? Like some critics, right? Like they argue that experience is never like raw.
Right.
It's always being like interpreted through these like existing frameworks and understandings and, meaning.
Right.
Like the way that I understand my own oppression, right, is going to be shaped by, the cultural background I come from, the beliefs I hold, the language, even the language I use to like even understand myself.
So someone could come in and say, well, you only feel marginalized because you're viewing the situation through this particular lens, not because there's any kind of objective reality to it.
Exactly. And then that leads to this like whole critique of this thing called like an epistemology of provenance.
Right.
Which is this idea that like, only people with certain experiences, right, are like seen as legitimate knowers.
Right.
Right. And it's like, well, then who gets to decide whose experience is valid, whose experience is not? And so it kind of becomes the slippery slope, right?
Totally. It's like, where does it end, right?
Yeah.
If we go down that path.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing, right, that there are counter arguments to this. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think like there have been attempts, I think, by like, certain philosophers to try to like ground experience in a more like, firmer foundation, if you will.
Right.
Like we can think about someone like Linda Martin Alcoff, who draws on phenomenology
Yeah.
to try to really like, emphasize the like the direct, almost like bodily visceral experience of oppression before it gets like filtered through all these like intellectual theories.
Right. So it's like even if the interpretation, comes later, that initial feeling, right, of pain, of being excluded, that's real, right? And you can't just dismiss that.
Right. Exactly. And then like, Black feminist thought, I'm thinking of like, scholars like Christy Dotson, who really like highlight the importance of like storytelling, right, as a way to like ground those political perspectives in lived realities, like that it's these narratives, it's these testimonies that become these like really powerful tools to actually like share and validate those experiences.
Okay, so we're starting to see, right, how identity in itself becomes a very philosophically tricky thing. But then we have this other layer, right, this other layer of complexity that we also have to think about, which is this idea of intersectionality.
Yes. Intersectionality is so crucial, right? Like it reminds us that identities are interconnected.
Yeah.
It's like you can't just like isolate one axis like race or gender. Like they all kind of overlap and influence each other.
Right. So just for our listener, I'm sure they're very familiar with the concept, but we're not just talking about like abstract categories here.
Yeah, right.
We're talking about like how this actually plays out in lived realities, right?
Right.
So like, for instance, like a Black working class woman is going to experience sexism, right? In a very different way than, say, like, a wealthy white woman.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And this is where, like, single-axis identity politics, can sometimes run into problems, right? Like, if we think about, like, even, like, second-wave feminism, right? Like, groundbreaking as it was, it often centered the experiences of, like, white middle-class women. Right. And so overlooking the like specific challenges and like struggles faced by, women of color, working class women, queer women.
Which, reminds me of like Gloria Anzaldúa and her work, right? Where she talks about this like this mestiza identity, this kind of blend of being Chicana, American, raised poor, a lesbian, a feminist. And it's like it really highlights how any kind of simplistic notion of like a singular unified identity really just kind of falls apart, right, when we actually look at lived experience.
It does. And don't forget, like, even, like, the critiques that, like, feminists in the global South have made, right? The challenging, like, those universalizing tendencies of some, northern feminist claims.
Right.
Being like, hey, wait a minute. Like, to assume that there's this shared women's experience across all these vastly different contexts, like, that can actually end up perpetuating inequalities.
Right.
Right. So there's that as well.
So it's like intersectionality is really forcing us to think about these nuances, right, and these complexities within any given identity group. It's not about erasing difference, but understanding how all these different forms of oppression can actually interact and reinforce each other.
Precisely.
So we have that. And then I think that leads us to another kind of like even bigger question, which is like, okay, So if these categories,
Yeah.
right, these categories of race, of gender, all these things that we've been talking about,
Yeah.
if they're themselves socially constructed,
Yeah.
right, like how stable are the identities that are built upon them,
Yeah.
right? Because if it's like the ground is always shifting, right, how do you actually build a solid foundation for a political movement? Or even how do you define like a shared experience, right? If the categories themselves are also kind of fluid and constantly in flux, right, and
Yeah.
changing.
Yeah.
So that's like,
That's where things get even more philosophically interesting. Right. And we need to like turn to like how post-structuralist thinkers have kind of challenged this very notion of like, a fixed essential self. And believe me, this is where it gets like pretty mind-bending.
yeah.
Yeah, so post-structuralists, they're like, hold on a second. This whole idea of a fixed essential self, like we often just assume in identity politics, it's an illusion. Like our identities, they aren't predetermined. They're always being shaped by language, by power relations, by, all these social structures that we're embedded in.
Okay, I see where this is going. Because if there is no stable me underneath it all, right,
Right.
then how can you base an entire political movement, right, on this idea of shared identity?
Yeah.
That's like building a house on sand.
Exactly. And so, like, think about, for example, William Connolly.
Yeah.
A political theorist who really works with a lot of these ideas. He says identities are actually defined as much by what they exclude as by what they include.
Okay.
Right? So you're constantly like drawing these boundaries, right? Saying like, we're this, not that. And Connolly's argument is that this can actually end up reinforcing the very hierarchies that identity politics is trying to dismantle.
So instead of breaking free, right, from
Yeah.
these oppressive categories, you actually end up getting trapped in like this binary thinking.
Right.
You're always defining yourself against something else.
Right. And then you have someone like Judith Butler,
Of course.
whose work on gender and performativity, I mean, it's just been hugely influential.
Usually.
And she argues that gender isn't this thing you are, it's something you do.
Right.
It's created through these repeated actions, these performances, the ways we present ourselves to the world.
So it's not, I am a woman. It's like, I perform womanhood.
Exactly.
Right. But then it's all performance, right? Does that undermine the idea that there are real lived experiences of oppression?
Right.
That are based on gender or based on race or any of these categories?
Right. And that's like the tension, I think, that these critiques really bring up, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, like they highlight how identity is, fluid, it's constructed, it's open to change, right?
Right.
But that can then make it hard to, to ground a political movement, right? If like who we are is always in flux.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes it hard to like have a solid we to rally around. Right.
Exactly. And so I think, this whole discussion really ties directly into, I think, like, another big philosophical question, which is how does identity politics actually relate to liberalism?
Ooh, okay.
Right? Like, are they compatible?
Right.
Or are they actually fundamentally at odds?
Now, that's a debate I think that our philosopher listener will really sink their teeth into because, I mean, liberalism on the one hand, right, is all about these individual rights, these universal values.
Right.
Whereas identity politics, we've been talking about it, right? It's about like group difference, particular experiences of injustice. And those seem like they could clash, those two things.
Yeah, they absolutely can. And you have, critics of identity politics who argue that it's actually like a threat to liberalism.
Yeah.
They say that it's, divisive, right? It pits groups against each other instead of, promoting some kind of like common good.
Right.
And they say it can actually lead to this focus on symbolic recognition rather than like actually addressing material inequalities.
So it becomes more about like feeling seen than it does about actually changing like the systems that are creating inequality in the first place.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah.
Like if we think about someone like Francis Fukuyama, he argues that identity politics, whether it's on the left or the right, it's distracting from economic issues.
Right.
And it's just fueling tribalism.
Okay.
And he sees it as like eroding like social cohesion.
Oh, yeah.
That sense of like shared citizenship that like liberal democracies rely on.
Okay, so there's some serious charges being leveled here.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's another side to this story, right?
Yeah.
People who see identity politics as either compatible with or even necessary for a just society.
Oh, absolutely. And I think defenders of identity politics, they would argue that it can actually strengthen liberalism.
Okay.
Right? Like help it to actually live up to its own ideals of equality and inclusion. And they say that liberalism often, like, just fails to actually see, the systemic oppression that's faced by certain groups
Right.
because it's so focused on the individual,
Right.
not the group.
So it's like saying, well, everyone has equal opportunity,
Right.
but ignoring all the historical and social realities that actually make that like a very unequal playing field.
Exactly. And you have, Iris Marion Young, for example,
Yeah.
who's this political philosopher who wrote extensively on justice. And, she critiques this very idea of like the neutral liberal citizen. She's like,
Right.
that assumed neutrality often masks existing power imbalances, Like it's implicitly white male
It's
privilege.
like saying we're all equal under the law,
Right.
but ignoring the fact that the law was written by and for, a very specific group of people.
Exactly, exactly. And
Yeah.
this connects to, critiques of like assimilation, right? As
Yeah.
like a goal of liberalism.
Yeah.
It's like marginalized groups should just kind of like fit into the dominant culture.
But
Right.
that can often mean like erasing or suppressing like what makes them unique.
Right. It's that idea of like, you can be equal as long as you become like us,
Right, exactly.
which misses the entire point, right, of identity politics, which is about affirming those differences, not erasing them. But then this whole debate gets even more interesting, I think, when we bring in like critiques from the left.
Yes.
Because it's not just liberals versus critics of identity politics. It's
Yeah.
like even within the left itself, there are all of these concerns about where identity politics has gone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like there's this argument that it's become too focused on like, individual experience and that it's like lost sight of these like broader, structural issues, especially class.
So it's like that classic Marxist critique, right?
Right, exactly.
That class struggle should be the like primary engine of social change.
Right.
And that identity politics can kind of be a distraction from that. Exactly, exactly. And, you have thinkers like Olufemi Taiwo who, he uses this concept of elite capture to talk about how, like, even the language and the strategies of social justice movements have been, like, co-opted by elites. So it becomes this kind of, like, performative wokeness, but without any real commitment to, like, systemic change.
So it's like those corporations that like, slap a rainbow on their logo during Pride Month, but then aren't actually doing anything to address like, LGBTQ discrimination in their hiring practices.
Precisely, precisely. And then, like, Nancy Fraser, another very prominent voice on the
Yeah.
left, she makes this distinction between, like, recognition, right,
Yeah.
and redistribution. And
Right.
she argues that social justice movements need to do both, right? They need to recognize marginalized identities and redistribute resources and power.
So it's not an either situation,
Yeah.
right? You need both cultural change and economic justice.
Right, exactly, exactly. And while, like, some, leftist critics might, like, dismiss identity politics outright, others, I think, offer this more kind of, like, nuanced view, right? So, like, you have Susanna Danuta Walters, for example.
Yeah.
She points out that critiques of identity politics, they often ignore the, like, identity of those in power.
Okay.
Right? Like power itself is often rooted in a particular identity, usually white and male.
So it's like saying, well, let's just not talk about race.
Right.
When race is like the very foundation, right, of a whole system of power and privilege.
Exactly. And Walters also argues, right, that many contemporary social justice movements, especially those led by women of color,
Yeah.
are actually deeply engaged with economic issues.
Okay.
They're fighting for concrete changes that would benefit everyone, not just members of their specific group.
So it's a more holistic and intersectional approach
Yes.
that recognizes the interplay of identity, economics, power, all these different things.
Yes. And that brings us to this, I think, a crucial question for our listener, right? Like,
Okay.
what's next for identity politics?
Right.
Given all of these critiques and complexities, like, where does it go from here? Is it destined to, like, fade away, or, like, is it evolving into something new?
Right, because on the one hand, it seems like even the term itself has become almost toxic, right?
Yeah.
A way to just kind of like dismiss any attempt to like even talk about, the injustices that particular groups face.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like the underlying issues haven't gone away,
Right.
right? We still need ways to understand and address like, oppression that's based on identity, however you want to define that. So if identity politics, as we've traditionally understood it, is maybe at a crossroads, are there other paths forward? What are some of those like emerging trends that you mentioned that might take us beyond these kind of traditional categories of identity?
Well, one area that I think is really fascinating is disability studies. It really challenges that idea of disability as like a fixed category, something you either are or aren't.
Right.
And instead, it focuses on, the lived experiences of disability and how social structures create these barriers and inequalities.
I bet. So instead of seeing disability as like an individual problem to be overcome, right,
Right.
it's actually framed as like a social and political issue.
Exactly.
It's about changing the environment, not the person.
Right. It's about accessibility. It's about inclusion. It's about, recognizing that different people have different needs, different abilities. And that's okay, right? Like, we don't need to, like, fit everyone into these, like, neat little boxes. And I think, this way of thinking, it can really challenge, like, those, like, binary categories that we were talking about earlier.
Hmm.
It's not like disabled versus able-bodied, but, like, a whole spectrum of human variation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And speaking of like challenging categories, I'm also thinking about how technology, especially online spaces, is impacting how we even understand identity. It's like a
Yeah.
whole new frontier where people are, you know, creating and exploring different aspects of themselves all the time.
Right. And the Stanford Encyclopedia actually mentions this idea of prophilicity
Yeah.
that these philosophers, Paul D'Ambrosio and Hans-Georg Mueller, came up with. And they argue that social media encourages us to, like, construct these online profiles that are constantly being, like, validated and, commented on by others. And it creates this, like, feedback loop, right, that can really shape our sense of self.
So it's like our online personas, in a way, are becoming more and more intertwined with our like offline identities.
Right.
And that kind of raises those questions we were discussing earlier, right?
Right.
About authenticity and performativity. Like, are we really being ourselves online, or are we just, playing roles?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think there are easy answers, to be honest.
Right.
But I think it's definitely something that, like, our philosopher listener can ponder.
Yeah.
Like, how do these digital spaces where identity is so fluid and malleable, like, how does that challenge our traditional ways of thinking about, politics and social justice?
It's like we're all living these, like, multiple lives online, and those lives are impacting how we see ourselves, how others see us. It's like a whole new layer of complexity for identity politics to
Yeah.
grapple with.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's not just, technology, right?
Yeah, right.
There are also all these like new philosophical currents, I feel like, that are also kind of pushing us beyond these like old categories, right? Like these fixed essentialist ideas about identity.
Absolutely. Think about new materialism and neo-vitalism,
Mm.
for example.
Yeah.
These are philosophies that really emphasize, like, processes of becoming over, these static states of being.
Yeah.
And they really challenge those, like, rigid boundaries that we often draw between ourselves and the world.
Right. So instead of asking, who am I? Which assumes that there's like a fixed and stable answer, right?
Right.
We should be asking, like, what am I becoming? You know?
Yeah.
It's a more dynamic, a more fluid way of understanding ourselves.
Exactly. And these philosophies, they also often critique, like, that human-centeredness that we see in a lot of, like, traditional Western thought.
Right.
They kind of blur the lines between, like, humans and other animals, between the living and the non-living, even between, like, subjects and objects.
So it's a much more expansive and interconnected view of the world where like identity is constantly kind of shifting and evolving in relation to like everything around us.
Right.
Which makes me wonder, like, if we start to let go of these rigid categories, these fixed identities, does that mean we also let go of identity politics altogether?
Yeah.
Is that even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, I think what we've seen in this deep dive is that identity politics is inherently paradoxical. It relies on categories that it also seeks to challenge.
Right.
It grapples with this tension between, like, individual experience and collective action.
It's messy,
Yeah.
it's complicated,
Yeah.
and it's constantly evolving. But as you said, even earlier, like, the term itself still holds power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, people are still debating it. They're still using it to kind of like frame their political struggles.
Absolutely.
At that-
Absolutely. And I think that, like, for our philosopher listener, like, I think the key takeaway is this, like, identity politics isn't a settled issue.
Right.
There are no easy answers here. There's no dogma to, like, cling to. It's this ongoing process, of, like, critical reflection and engagement.
It's about asking those tough questions, right?
Yeah.
About power, about privilege,
Yeah.
about how our identities are actually shaped by the world around us.
Yeah.
And then it's also about finding ways, right, to
Right.
actually create a more just and equitable society,
Right.
even if the path forward isn't always, like, totally clear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So to our listener, we encourage you to keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep engaging in these really crucial conversations. Because ultimately, I think the future of identity politics, whatever that may look like, is something that, we create together.
Well said. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive into the very complex and very fascinating world of identity politics. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another exploration of ideas that matter.